Welcome back, you guys, and thank you for joining me once again at Manny School of Art. We've been doing a lot of work with ink lately, so today's video is going to focus on how to do ink washes to create a portrait. And I'm going to walk you through the steps that I did. So we're going to use this grid drawing that I did of my granddaughter a while back, and I'm going to show you the steps that I took to turn the grid drawing into an ink wash drawing. Because of the length of the video, I am going to break it up into chapters to just to break it up for you guys, and then you can go to whichever one is appropriate. So like the first chapter, for example, is going to be how to stretch watercolor paper. If you already know how to stretch watercolor paper, then you can just skip that and go to the next chapter. Second chapter will be how to do the underpainting. Third chapter will be how to add the layers and so forth and so on. So I'll put a list in the comments below. As always, if you like what you're seeing, if the content is helpful, please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and leave me some comments. Comments are helpful. It'll help me figure out what I need to do better in these videos. Okay? So, let's go ahead and get started, and hope you enjoyed the video. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to prepare our watercolor paper to paint. And for this one, I'm actually going to show you how I go about stretching the watercolor paper. So what you're going to need a piece of plywood bigger than the watercolor paper. Mine happens to be 3/4 inch, but you could probably get away with a 1/2 inch. And it's just some old plywood that I had lying around. You're going to need a staple gun. It does not have to be electric. It just has to be a decent quality staple gun to drive the staples into the wood. You're going to need a water bottle in order to saturate the paper, and some eye protection. Anytime you're working with tools, you need to protect your eyes. Okay? So, first thing I'm going to do, and some kneaded eraser. So since I use chalk to transfer the drawing onto the watercolor paper, the first thing that I want to do is I want to get a kneaded eraser, and I'm just going to go over the whole thing and remove like any loose chalk. So just taking my kneaded eraser, putting it into a little thing like this, and I'm just going to roll over just to lift any loose chalk. That's it. I'm not trying to remove it. I'm just trying to lift some of the extra stuff that might still be in there. If a little bit stays on there, it's not a big deal, right? Because most of this is going to be covered with ink. The next thing that we need to do is we need to saturate the paper on both sides. I'm going to use a water bottle, but if you have a big like plastic tub that you can put water in, you can actually just soak the paper in there for about 10 minutes and do the same thing. I don't happen to have one down here, so I'm just going to do it this way. And I want to saturate both sides. Plenty of water. Now, this technique works if you are using 140-pound watercolor paper or better, and it needs to be cold pressed. So saturate it really, really well. If it activates the chalk, it's not a big deal. I still have my original references, so if I need to, I can redraw some of the pieces that go away, and just kind of like make sure that it's being worked in there. Because what I'm trying to do for this one, because the watercolor paper is bigger, I don't like to use tape. Right? Tape is great for small pieces, but not so good with the big pieces. I want to get that water to really, really go into the watercolor paper. Now I'm not going to rub this side because I don't want to take the chance of messing up the drawing. But I really, really want to make sure that the entire paper is soaked in. So, how does this work? When you soak the watercolor paper, it actually expands, right? As the pulp gets filled with water, it expands. And then I'm going to go around and I'm going to staple all the way around, roughly about 3/4 of an inch to an inch away from the border. All right. And then I can work on this while it's wet, or I can dry it. As the paper dries, it's actually going to shrink, and it's going to re-stretch itself, basically. With this technique, the thing that I like about it is that you can keep wetting the paper over and over again. So I can wet it, work on it for a while, dry it, work on certain sections, and it tends to re-stretch itself very nicely every time, where that's not always the case with just the tape. Okay. Alright, so I think that's pretty good right there. So now all I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start stapling, and it doesn't have to be pretty. Later on we're going to take all these off anyway, so just start going around. Helps if I turn it on. Roughly, you can rough estimate about 1.5 to 2 inches apart. You don't want them too far apart because then you'll still get buckling, so you got to make sure that they're close enough. Alright, let's keep going all the way around. And I'm going to spin this around so I don't put the staple on the work. I ran out of staples, so I'm going to reload and then I'll finish this up. So once you have the piece completely taped all the way around, and you'll notice that these are relatively close together, then you want to take a clean towel and then just remove a little bit of the extra water. You'll notice when you do this that sometimes the water just floats on top of the paper. That means the paper is full. It cannot absorb any more water. Okay. So before I start painting, I'm going to go ahead and remove any extra water. Okay. And I can also clean up these edges a little bit around it. Okay. And that's really it. That's all you need to do in order to stretch your watercolor paper. Now you see, like, you got some areas that they have these little bumps. As this watercolor paper starts to dry, all of those will actually be stretched and it'll flatten out again. Okay, so this is now ready to move on to the first layer of ink. Alright, so before we start inking a project like this, you want to make sure that you have all your supplies ready to go. So I have paper towels, I have a container of clean water, I have another container to clean my brushes, I have my standard watercolor brushes that I like to use, and I'm also putting in a 3-inch hake brush, which has very, very soft bristles, and I'm going to use this whenever I need to wet a large area. I actually don't paint with this. And then we are going to be using the Speedball permanent ink. I have my reference materials on standby. So let's take a look at the reference material real quick. First thing that I notice is, where's the light source going to come from? By looking at this picture, I can see that this side of her face is a little bit on the bright side, and this side is slightly darker, and there's a shadow here. So I'm thinking that the light source is from the top right. Okay, because really, if you think about it, all we're doing when we're doing ink washes is adding our shadows, different types of shadows. So we have some really soft shadows, and we have some kind of really dark shadows, and then we have stuff in between, and we also have highlights. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that I like to do when I do something like this is I like to start in with my light washes. I can always darken a wash, but with ink, once you make it dark, if it dries on you, you're done with it. Okay, so there's two techniques that I'm going to be using. The first one is just doing some gradient washes, and then I'm going to also be doing some layering. And layering simply means that I'm going to dry it in between washes, and then apply new washes, which is one of the big advantages of working with ink, is that once the ink dries, it's permanent, so you can build up your layers a little bit at a time. So I'm going to go ahead and start working on our first layer, and basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to wet the surface, and then I'm going to put in a very light gray, with the exception of the areas that need to stay pure white. So mist the area a little bit. Take my Hake brush just to kind of smooth out the water. Very gentle. This brush is very soft, so it does not damage the paper whatsoever. And then I'm going to reach in here, grab a little bit of the ink, and I'm going to mix up a really nice light gray. Really light. And I have extra paper all over the place, so I can always test my values on the edges. So that's too dark, so I'm going to add a little bit more water to it. A little bit more water still. Alright, so in this layer I don't have to be super careful, because this is just putting in my first layer and essentially kind of establishing more or less where the highlights are going to be, really, because where the areas that I leave blank are going to be the highlight areas. Now you'll notice, because the paper is really wet, that it gives me all kinds of time to blend, which is why this method, in my opinion, when you're working on something big, works better than the tape, because you can really saturate the paper all the way through, which gives you a lot more time for mixing. So now this area is going to be a little bit brighter right here, so I got to make sure that I don't let that get too dark. So in this edge here, near the hair, the hair is going to cast a shadow on that, so I can leave that area a really nice soft gray, light gray. Here there's some streaks there that I don't like, so I'm going to fade them away before the ink has time to dry. And all I'm doing is I'm wiping off the extra ink off my brush, and then just using the tip of the brush to blend. I don't care that a little bit got into the hair, because the hair is going to be dark anyways, darker. Okay. So again, all I'm doing is establishing areas where there's some soft shadows. So like right here, there's a shadow here where the socket goes back away from the nose, and there's a little shadow here. There's a highlight here, and then another shadow here, because this is basically a three-dimensional cylinder, so some areas are going to be light and some areas are going to be slightly darker. Not worrying about the eyebrows and stuff yet, those will come later when I do details. Near the tip of the nose, to the left of the tip, there's a shadow there, and then it fades away. So I'm going to clean my brush and fade that before it dries. Not going to do the nostrils yet, I'll wait till the paper's dry to do the details. There is a little shadow here. Oops, not quite dark enough. Right here. And a little bit here where this wraps down like this, there's a shadow just behind that. And again, when I say shadow, this is the first layer, so these shadows are very soft. Very, very soft. This one was actually a little bit too dark, but because the paper is wet, I can make changes to it. So while the paper is wet, I'm actually going to put a layer on the hair, and it's going to be ever so slightly darker than the face. And then I think I'm going to dry it before moving on to the next stage. So mix in a slightly darker value than what I had. And again, I'm not going to get close to the edges, not yet, but I want to kind of establish this value here. And all I'm doing is I'm putting in the values, and my brush strokes, I'm kind of just going with the flow of the hair. And then later on, as we build this up, we can kind of like suggest where some of the strands are going to be. Okay. Alright, so we have this completely dried and it's ready to add new layers. You can actually see, if you look closely at the staples, how the paper's actually being pulled. That's because it's shrinking, or shrunk as we dried it. Okay, so now this is actually nice and dry and the ink is permanent. So if you needed to like redraw something or put some notes down in there for yourself, so for example, if I say I'm going to put a shadow here, it's going to fade here, and it's going to get shadow here, you could do that with a pencil, because when you erase, it's not going to affect the ink whatsoever. Okay, it might take slightly off on the light areas, but you won't lose the ink because the ink is permanent. Okay, so I'm going to show you how I deal with smaller details, and then we're just going to continue to build this up. So we know that the eyeball is white, but it's going to have some shadows in it because it's in 3D. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take some clean water and I'm going to wet this entire area, just the inside of the eye itself. And then using a very light gray, I'm going to put in the shadows where the eyeball is going into the head, right? So it's a very soft shadow, because the highlight for the white part of the eye is going to be right here. Okay, now I can do the same thing for the other side. So I'm going to wet this entire area, just the inside of the eye, and then I'm just going to put some soft shadows where the eyeball is going into the socket. It's always a good idea to test your values before you put it on, because Now that the paper is not completely wet, I'm only wetting very small areas, those areas will dry pretty quick because the paper is not fully saturated like it was when we first started. Okay, so while that's drying, I'll just work on a different part of the drawing. So let's go ahead and start working on the lips. So I'll come in here, and the top lip is going to be a little bit darker than the bottom lip, but I can actually just take a medium value and paint in the entire lip, and then put in my slightly darker value on the top one. And then the catch light on the lips is here and here, so I'm going to be a little bit careful not to cover everything up. So I'm going to start kind of in the middle and then work my way towards the edges. Okay. So now we'll let this dry, and then we'll darken up the top lip, especially where the two lips meet. Okay. So while that's drying, I could go work on the ear, or I could work on the hair, or I could work on the neck. You just build this up gradually, and then in between layers, if you need to, just dry it. The second layer mostly done and dry. So now we can start working on some of the little details, and then we can make adjustments. So I'm going to show you how to do this eye, and then I'll do the inner part of the nostrils, maybe the lips, and then we'll dry it. So I took a pencil and I just kind of darkened this up and straightened up the circle a little bit. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to paint this outer area here and not the pupil. Even though I know the pupil is going to be right here, I'm not going to do that yet. I'm just going to paint right over it, and then later on I'll put the pupil in, because the pupil is just black anyways, so we don't have to worry about it. So switching over to my smaller brush, and she's got light eyes, so oops, that was a little dirty. I'm going to go ahead and wet this area, the entire area, kind of staying a little bit away from the edges just so that I can have a little bit more control. And then I'm going to reach in with a very, very soft gray, very light gray. And I'm going to start working, try to keep my hand out the way. I'm going to start working from the edges towards the center. So I'm making her eyes the value that I want, more or less, but I'm also suggesting some of the textures. And again, I'm not worried about the edge, or the pupil, because that's dark enough where I can cover it. Also, I don't want to do the edge yet, because the edge, it's a little bit, it's kind of like a darkish ring, and I want to do that when the paper is nice and wet, or nice and dry. Okay? So I'm going to repeat the same thing for the other. Okay. For the inner part of the nose, I've already put in a little shadow underneath it, and we can see a dark shadow here that forms the nostrils. Okay, but it's not pure black. So what I'm going to do is, this time, this is small enough where I don't have to pre-wet the area. So it's going to be even more important that I check my values. So that it's a little on the dark side. So alright, so that looks pretty good. So I'm going to start here, right up to where that line is on both sides. Then I'm gonna rinse my brush, dry it, and fade it down just a little bit. I don't want to create an outline. Okay, all I want to do is create a shadow, because that's really all that's happening, is the light can't get in there, so it's casting a shadow inside of the nostrils. And then this lower lip, like right, or this little, the lower tip here, has a little bit of a shadow on this side. Not much. And then just fade it, because I don't want to leave outlines. So it's just putting in shadows. Okay. Now I'm going to work on the lip. I'm going to do the top lip first. When I look at the reference photo, this area here is nice and dark, and then as it goes this way, it fades a little bit towards the medium. And then on the bottom one, the darkest area is going to be right in this area right here. We gotta let this dry, and we gotta let that dry. So while all of that is drying, I'm gonna go ahead and put a shadow on the cheek. Now, when you look at the reference material here, there is a soft shadow here, and then there's a reflective light here, and then the shadow of the neck. So we're gonna try to create that, which will give us that separation that we need. So I'm gonna switch over to my bigger brush, slightly bigger brush, and I'm only using this for wetting the area. Again, so I'm going to wet this area here on this lower part of the jaw. And I always wet an area slightly bigger than what I need. And then I'm going to go in with my smaller brush and I'm not going to start at the edge because there's a reflective light there, so I'm actually going to start up here, and then I'm just going to gradually pull it down and fade it up. Okay. Now, like right now, that reflective light is way too wide, but that's intentional. If I get it too close to the edge, and then if I lose control of my brush, it'll look very strange. So first, I'm going to blend the top part so it's a nice soft shadow. And then with clean water, and I'm going to start bringing this down closer to that line. And it's starting to dry up, so I may have to add just a little bit more. So I'm going to wet this area just a little bit more. And add just a little bit more ink. This time fading it down. Now the reflective light, you don't want it to be pure white. It just needs to be lighter than this shadow and that shadow. So I'm going to take it down, leave that little area there, and then I'm going to darken this edge a little bit and fade it down. And that should give me the effect that I'm looking for. One of the layers for the hair. So let me show you here on the reference material. There's a sheen right here, there's another sheen right here, there's another sheen right here, a little bit here. So those areas are going to be midtones. Then you have strong shadows underneath here, you have strong shadows here, you have strong shadows here. So we're going to be working on the hair, but it's just a matter of putting in shadows. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to do one section at a time. Right? That way I'm in control. So I'm going to wet this area first. And I'm using my round brush just so that I can get into these little corners. And then this part comes this way down. And then I'm going to go in with a slightly darker color than I did the last time I did the hair. Yeah, it feels pretty good. So I'm going to try to keep my hand out the way. And I'm just going to start putting in the color in the direction that I want the hair to flow. Again, I'm not drawing the individual strands or anything. I'm just putting in my second layer. That sheen is right in here. So I'm going to wipe off my brush and I'm going to let that fade where that sheen, where I want that sheen to be. And then it starts to get a little bit darker here. There is a little bit of a sheen right here as well. And then there's a dark shadow there. So now, again, I'm going to try to keep my hand out the way. I need to start going in this direction. Then I'm going to rinse and dry my brush. And then get rid of all of those little, I don't know what they're called, but those little weird patterns that are created from the water. And I'm going to leave that little sheen right there. Alright, so we're on the home stretch now. So from here on out, most of it is just doing detail work and then just separating the face from the hair and fine tuning, and we'll probably do like a little vignette in the background. So let's go ahead and start working on this eyeball right here. So what I'm going to do here is just like before. I'm going to wet the entire eyeball, being extra careful around the edges. This time I'm going to go in with pure ink, maybe a little bit of a dark gray. Let's do a dark gray. And I'm going to sharpen my brush by spinning it. And then I'm not going to draw an outline. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of like touch and let the water kind of bring it into the eye, so that it creates like a darkish ring around it rather than doing an outline. Okay, so now we got to do, that's dry. So now we want to do the area like above this eye right here and above this eye right here. That is her lid, her eyelid, and so we need to put that in there. And this one is thin enough where I'm not going to wet the area first. So I'm loading the brush, and see if you can see it here. Loading the brush, and then I'm spinning it to try to bring it back to a tip. Nice, like nice tip to it. Not quite there yet, so there's not enough ink on it. Yeah, that's pretty close. And then just with a steady hand, just going to come in here, draw that lid, but Got to fade it a little bit so it doesn't look like a hard outline. So this is starting to dry up on me because the paper was dry, so it got absorbed pretty quick. So I'm going to do it again. Sharpening the tip, this time on a wet surface. There we go. So in that case, you actually saw a mistake, but not terrible where we can't fix it. There you go. Same thing on the other side, but this time I better wet the area first, just a little bit. We're not talking about saturating the paper. It's just putting in a little bit of water so that we have time for blending. Okay, let's get it back to a tip, sharp tip. There we go. And just this one line. Wipe off the extra. Fade the bottom. There. Now for her eyelashes. I'm not going to draw them individually. What I'm going to do is I'm going to represent them. And I'm going to try to do it with the brush. So, it's not too easy because I got to keep my body out of the way. But the nearest, her lashes are really short here. So when we get here, this line has got to be really thin. And then as it comes this way, it starts to get a little thicker. And I'm going to just suggest where they are. I'm not going to sit there and draw each one. So all I did was thicken up that line a little bit. And you'll notice that it goes past the eye. On the bottom one, we got to make sure that it's coming from the outer lid. And they're a little bit lighter and a little bit further apart. Okay, so not the inner one, but this outer one, and they're just kind of curling this way. So they curl downward. And they're a little bit lighter than the top ones. That's it. On the inner part there, I'll have to get one of the erasers and get a little bit of that purple off. And I'll just do the other eye. Same way. So, nice and thin here. And then as it goes that way, it gets a little bit thicker past the eye. And then on the bottom one, make sure we're going to the outer part. And they're shorter. So I wiped off the extra. There we go. Okay, so now we gotta let that dry a little bit before we do the pupils. So I'm gonna hit the mouth one more time. Right here, I don't feel like it's quite dark enough, so I'm going to get in here and just put in a little soft shadow there. And then fade it before it dries, just a little bit. And bring it all the way out here. And then fade it down. underneath the lip there's going to be a really soft shadow. So take some clean water, wet this area. Since the light source is primarily coming from the top right, then this soft shadow is going to be on the left side. So it's a very light shadow, just to give the suggestion that the lips are, they stand away from the face. Just like so. I'll dry my brush as I've been doing and fade that little shadow away. Okay. So while I wait for this part here to dry, I'm going to work on the hair a little bit and start really separating the strands and cleaning up these edges, and then we'll take one last look at it and see how everything looks and call it done. Okay, and now I do have to start paying attention to what the lines are doing, what the hair is doing. So I'm going to wet these little sections here. Paying very close attention to where the hair meets the cheek. And then start putting in the shadows. This area here underneath this big strand, it's got to be darker. And then as it comes down, it gets lighter. Her hair close to her cheek, it's a little bit lighter than as it goes out. Excuse me, a little bit darker. And I want to suggest some of the movement in her hair now at this point. Still keeping it relatively loose. I'm not trying to draw like each individual strand. I just want to give the impression of what the hair is doing and where the strands are appearing darker and where they appear lighter, and the general flow of the hair. Alright, so we're just about done, so I'm going to go ahead and just show you a little bit of the fine-tuning process, and then we're going to call it there. So I went ahead and redrew where the pupils are going to be, and the pupils are pretty dark, so I'm going to go in there with my little brush, and without wetting the paper, I'm just going to go ahead and pop those in. I'm going to go ahead and do this eyebrow a little bit. This is what an ink eraser looks like, so it's got this gray color on one side, and then the other, it says ink right on it, and then the other one says pencil on it. Now this is not going to remove everything, but it does a pretty good job of lightening things up. So what you're actually doing when you do this is you're actually sanding a little bit of the paper. So you have to kind of be careful and make sure that if you do this, make sure that the paper is completely dry. So you'll notice that I put in a shadow here, but I didn't put the hair in there. And the reason for that is because underneath the hair, you're going to actually see the skin. So I actually put in the color of the skin first. And now I'm going to use my brush. Brought it back up to a very nice sharp tip. And I'm going to do kind of dry brushing. So I'm trying to keep my hand out of the way. So I'm using the guidelines to kind of help me figure out what the overall shape should look like. But really what I'm doing is I'm putting in the texture. And then we know that the eyebrow comes away from the head a little bit, from the face a little bit, so I'm going to put a very soft shadow underneath it. But I'm not going to do it with texture. I'm just going to suggest little shadow. And just like before the shadow has an opportunity to dry, I'm going to fade it. Fade it away. And what that does, it makes that area look even brighter. Now I did the same thing for the other side. And then in some of these areas here, it's just a matter of going in and fine-tuning. And I'm just going to go through the entire drawing and make all my final adjustments. Okay. And then we'll come back to it and see what it looks like. Oh. Alright, so this is pretty much ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and put this here so you can see this is not the right matting, but I just want you to see a little bit of what this is going to look like once it's all been trimmed and matted. I still have to do a little bit of work here. I just noticed that. And then a little fine tuning here and there, but for the most part, this is the way it should look when it's done. Okay. I hope you liked the video. Thank you so much for watching. I enjoy bringing it to you. Please let me know what you think in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe. Alright, thank you so much.